Is it possible for an individual to change the course of history? And if so, what does that actually look like? Now, I don't have the answer to either of these questions, which is why I read books by people who are much smarter and more learned than myself. And in today's in today's video, I guess, doing episodes now. In today's video, I wanted to talk about the work of one Arnold J. Toynbee, the author of the extremely extensive A Study of History, which I have a copy of the abridgment of right here. Let's jump into it. So first, just to give a little bit of a breakdown about this book, I have, once, as I mentioned, I have the abridgment here. Now, the abridgment that I have in front of me is about 600 pages long. There are two of these. Those two are abridging a much longer work, which I believe is 13 volumes long, if I have that correctly. So all in all, the work is about 7,500 pages, and it is Toynbee's magnum opus, which I believe he published the completion of sometime in the 40s. Yeah, it says here 1946. The overall book includes the following titles: Introduction, The Genesis of Civilizations. By the way, the introduction is book one. The entire book one is an introduction. The Growths of Civilizations. And then breakdowns, disintegrations, universal states, universal churches, heroic ages, civilizations in space, civilizations in time, rhythms and the histories of civilizations, the prospects of the Western civilization, the inspirations of historians. So all in all, the work is incredibly long. I do recommend it if you're interested in books like this, though it is a little bit stuffy, and but that said, it is an absolute delight. But you're going to need some time to make your way through it and read it slowly enough to actually get the value. And so I'm going to give you an abbreviation of one of the ideas from the abbreviation of the overall work. And nevertheless, I think that'll be interesting to some people who are watching this. So how does Toynbee think changing history works as an individual? Central to his conception is this idea, which I'll be explaining today, of withdrawal and return. So what I want to do is actually start with a rather abstract quote of Toynbee's about the thing that he's talking about, and we're going to go from there into the specifics of many concrete examples of how withdrawal and return happens or has happened in history. Withdrawal and return is something that is done by creative individuals. They pass first out of action into ecstasy, and then out of ecstasy into action on a new and higher plane. In using such language, we describe the creative movement in terms of the personality's psychic experience. In terms of his external relations with the society to which he belongs, we shall be describing the same duality of movement if we call it withdrawal and return. And so he has this twin idea that the person psychologically leaves their society, goes into the beyond, into the void, something like that. And likewise, they may physically leave their society. And he's going to give a bunch of examples of this. So the first example he actually gives of this is Moses from the Old Testament, and talks about Moses' solitary ascent to Mount Sinai, where he ascends the mountain to commune with God. And this call is to Moses alone, where the other children of Israel are charged to keep their distance. And the purpose of this adventure being to receive the law in a position which is separate from his society, and then return back to the society in order to communicate it. Toynbee likes to depend on a lot of the Judeo-Christian history, but also makes an effort to show how this conception, or this phenomena at least, is cross-cultural. And he quotes the Arabic philosopher Ibn Khaldun here as well. The human soul has an innate disposition to divest itself of its human nature in order to clothe itself in the nature of the angels, and to become an angel in reality for a single instant of time, a moment which comes and goes as swiftly as the flicker of an eyelid. Thereupon the soul resumes its human nature, after having received in the world of angels a message which it has to carry to its own humankind. So just to rattle through a list of examples that Toynbee gives of this withdrawal and return phenomenon. He talks about St. Paul of Tarsus, who initially, and I believe the story is told in the New Testament, persecutes the Jewish followers of Jesus, and later on has a sudden enlightenment on the road to Damascus, and goes into the desert of Arabia, where he spends 3 years wandering, upon which time he returns to Jerusalem and meets the original apostles, and resumes practical activity as a member of the early church. Then we have another saint, Saint Benedict of Nursia, who lived around 480 to 543 AD, who initially is sent to Rome to get an education in the humanities, revolts against this, spends 3 years in the wilderness in utter solitude, and afterwards returns to found the Benedictine monasteries, which spread through early Christendom, and prescribe manual labor in the fields, which Toynbee says here promote a successful revival of agriculture in Italy, and also performed in medieval Transalpine Europe that strenuous pioneer work of clearing forests, draining marshes, and creating fields and pastures, which was performed in North America by the French and British backwoodsmen. Next we have another saint, Saint Gregory the Great, who withdrew from society for a period of 3 years and returned, occupied various ecclesiastical offices, and actually became pope in 590 to 604, and according to Toynbee accomplished 3 great tasks: reorganizing the administration of the states of the Roman Church in Italy and overseas, negotiating a settlement between the imperial authorities in Italy and the Lombard invaders, and laying the foundations of a new empire for Rome. The Buddha. So we have the Buddha born into a time of troubles, seeing his native city burned and his kinsmen massacred. The Buddha's personal retort, as Toynbee puts it, is to renounce the world. And for 7 years he sought enlightenment through ever-increasing asceticism, and thereafter Toynbee elaborates on how there's also this crucial return, which maybe didn't have to have happened. It was not until he had taken the first step towards returning to the world by breaking his fast that the light broke in upon him. And then, after he had attained the light for himself, he spent the rest of his life in imparting it to his fellow human beings. In order to impart it effectively, he allowed a company of disciples to gather round him, and thus became the center and head of a fraternity. So for Muhammad, Toynbee described the withdrawal and return actually happening 2 times. Firstly, with regard to his religious or purely religious mission, and secondarily his political one. And so we have the religious mission occurring after a partial withdrawal of some 15 years' duration into the life of a caravan trader between the Arabian oases and the Syrian desert ports of the Roman Empire along the fringes of the North Arabian steppe. And then the second mission occurs when Muhammad leaves Mecca and goes to Medina. In fact, leaves Mecca as a hunted fugitive. So this is another dimension, perhaps, of the withdrawal from society, right? And after a 7 years' absence, he returned to Mecca not as an amnestied exile, but as lord and master of half Arabia. Machiavelli is an interesting example here, and the first I've mentioned that is not specifically religious in character, where we have Machiavelli rising to power. When he's 29, he's appointed to an important government office, secretary of the government, but then in 1512, he was deprived of his secretaryship of state, and the following year he suffered imprisonment and torture. And although he was lucky enough to emerge again alive, the price which he had to pay for his release from prison was a perpetual rustication on his farm in the Florentine countryside. So interestingly, I believe that it's after this period that he actually writes his best works. And the way that Toynbee puts it is that his political hopes for Italy at the time are ultimately frustrated, but nevertheless, through his writings, Machiavelli was able to return to the world on a more ethereal plane, on which his effect on the world has been vastly greater than the highest possible achievement of a Florentine Secretary of State immersed in all the details of practical politics. And so he ends up producing these mighty intellectual works, The Prince, the Discourses on Livy, The Art of War, and the History of Florence, which have been seeds of Western political philosophy. So that's the basic idea, and make of it what you will. Toynbee characteristically focuses especially hard on spiritual creativity. I tend to think that his theory of history is rather spiritual in nature. But just to give a little bit more grounds to assess this idea of withdrawal and return, I'll spend a quick moment comparing it to a few other important ideas. So one of these is Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey, which a lot of people have heard of. And as you can see in the diagram, what we have here is this cyclical action, which in some sense maps onto Toynbee's idea, that you have the person who has to leave home, enter this abyss of death and rebirth before finding their way back and returning. Another completely different idea, which has some overlap with Toynbee's withdrawal and return, is what is known as the myth of the foundling. A babe born to a royal heritage is cast away in infancy, sometimes, as in the stories of Oedipus and Perseus, by his own father or grandfather, who is warned by a dream or an oracle that the child is destined to supplant him, sometimes, as in the story of Romulus, by a usurper, who has supplanted the babe's father and fears lest the babe should grow up to avenge him, and sometimes, as in the stories of Jason, Orestes, Zeus, Horus, Moses, and Cyrus, by friendly hands that are concerned to save the babe from the villain's murderous designs. In the next stage of the story, the infant castaway is miraculously saved alive, and in the third and last chapter, the child of destiny, now grown to manhood and wrought to a heroic temper by the hardships through which he has passed, returns in power and glory to enter into his kingdom. And so Toynbee specifically maps this on to the story of Jesus. Again, Toynbee is pretty Christian as far as I can tell. And he believes that the Jesus story has this withdrawal and return as well as the foundling myth in spades. And so in that story we have Jesus, the babe born to a royal heritage, a scion of David or a son of God himself, who is cast away in infancy, comes down from heaven to be born on earth. He's born in the city of Bethlehem, but he finds no room in the inn and has to be moved to a manger. He's watched over by friendly animals and shepherds, and is reared by a foster father of humble birth, like you might have in the case of Oedipus. He's saved from Herod's murderous designs by being taken away privily to Egypt, as Moses is saved by the Pharaoh's designs by being hidden in the bulrushes. And at the end of the story, Jesus returns, as the other heroes return, to enter into his kingdom, first riding into Jerusalem, and later, more grandly, into the kingdom of heaven through the ascension. Likewise, in the story of Jesus, we have his withdrawing into the wilderness for 40 days and returning from his temptation there, his withdrawal again to a mountain, his experience of the death of a mortal man in the crucifixion, his descent into the tomb in order to rise immortal thereafter, and according to Toynbee, in the idea of the second coming, the motif of withdrawal and return attains its deepest meaning. The third one of these that I want to mention is the Allegory of the Cave. And so a lot of people have heard the Allegory of the Cave, where this is Plato's idea that you have the sort of benighted cave dwellers who are seeing a shadow upon a wall and think that that's reality. And one among their number ascends from the cave into the daylight, into the real light of the sun, and is sort of amazed at what he sees, returns back down to the cave and tries to explain to his companions there that what they're seeing is not actually reality, they're only seeing shadows playing upon a wall. And so likewise, this follows Toynbee's sort of idea of the creative individual who must separate himself or herself or themselves from society in order to depart and later to return. So that's all I'm going to say on withdrawal and return for now, except to add that I found the idea interesting for thinking about my own life and the world around me. There's even a potential application to entrepreneurship. You know, a lot of people have heard Peter Thiel's question, what's something important that you believe that no one else believes? And latent in that notion is the idea that a person needs to have some secret. They need to have some knowledge that the rest of the world doesn't have. And so maybe on Toynbee's worldview, you'd have the creative or potentially creative individual going off into the wilderness or being exiled from their society or adopting a strange and new way of thinking or whatever it is in order to acquire that distinctive knowledge and distinctive attitude and approach to life in order to thereafter return to their society and do something useful about it.